You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Jimmy Carbone, I'm the host. It's our 15th year with Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. Make sure you check out our website. There's been some updates right now. All of our regular podcast links are on Apple now. They've always been on Apple, but on the site itself, they're hosted on Apple as well. So a couple upgrades. You might see a new logo too. But again, thanks so much for 15 years of support. Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. So there was a very interesting article in Good Beer Hunting not too long ago, and it was about the original Kegger out of Montana. And it's one of those stories that there's a lot more to it than just the fact that there was a lot of beer. So we're going to go around the room, and our two guests, who are both writers, historians, will introduce themselves. Start with Brian and then Cody.
Hey, everyone. I'm Brian Alberts. I'm a historian who studies beer in context, beer history and culture in the United States.
And I'm Cody Ewert, and I'm an associate editor at the Montana Historical Society.
Okay. So what brought you guys to writing about beer? Let's start with that. Brian and then Cody.
Sure. Well, I think beer is just a great window into talking about so many of the things that are important in the world. You sit down, you start talking about beer, and before you know it, you're talking about something else. You're talking about politics, you're talking about labor, you're talking about people, all kinds of people, all kinds of situations. It's hard to talk about beer and just stick to beer because oftentimes beer is so complicated. The way beer gets into your glass is so roundabout and so interesting that it's hard to just talk about beer and not talk about other things in the meantime. So I say, why not bring the other things into the conversation?
Yeah, just research for the show. I looked at your Brewed Culture site, and you have articles about 19th century Milwaukee and Chicago and Sunday laws and other things that are really, really interesting to me. So yeah, looking forward to talking to you further.
Absolutely.
And Cody, for you, you're a historian and you're on a beer show.
Yeah, that's right. And, most of my research I did earlier in my kind of career as a historian in grad school and everything wasn't really about beer. I was a historian of education mostly. And that's in part what led me to this Kegger story, which is always something I've been interested in just as a Montanan and as someone who is interested in all these things, musical festivals and in beer and the kind of culture of the state in the 70s. And so that things all just kind of collided. Several different interests collided in this story for me. So yeah, this is kind of my first foray into like beer research in a big way. But it's been a lot of fun.
So Cody, why don't you tell us what this Kegger was? It's in Montana, early 70s, the original Kegger.
Yeah, so this event basically starts in the early 70s and roughly, and I think 1972. And Brian, you can always chime in if I get a specific date wrong or something. But it starts in a sociology class at the University of Montana, basically. A professor was tasking the students with coming up with an event that would better the community. And at the time, the university library was struggling a little. It was short on books, and the book shortage was threatening its accreditation. So these students concocted this idea to throw a Kegger that would serve as a benefit concert to raise money for the library. And so they actually put this together, and after the semester, I think in June, they held what was the first event, which at the time they called the Library Kegger. Just found a patch of forest out east of town, set up a stage. A few bands from the region came in and played, and a few thousand people came out and drank a couple hundred kegs of beer, I think. And so that was really the start of it. And things kind of snowballed from there. It got this association with Aber Day, which was this old university tradition that was a campus cleanup day. It got that association the following year. Some people revived this campus cleanup effort, in part because, the students were interested in environmental issues, and they thought, well, this would be a good thing to dovetail with that. And the planners of that said, like, well, we should do some sort of a concert or something as part of this. And basically they said, well, the library Kegger last year, that seemed to go pretty well. So what if we just had them do that on this day? And so then the two things got kind of combined. But kind of importantly, the group that put together the Kegger was separate from the university. It was technically it was technically not a university-sponsored group, but they were students. And it was kind of a de facto university group. They got a lot of support from the university, and other campus groups helped out with the event as well. So yeah, that's the origin of it. And it runs between 1972 and 1979.
One thing I guess I'd add, this is Brian again. I guess I would just add, firstly, that first Kegger, again, it's a concert plus all the beer you can drink. The admission price was $2. So I just want to point that out so that everyone can just salivate for a second. The next thing I want to point out is that this was just like a little bit controversial at the time. Not to say that it was some completely risque taboo thing that they were doing, but keggers were on the rise as a practice throughout the country. Drinking, especially beer drinking, was on the rise nationwide. I think there was about a 25% increase in the per capita consumption of beer between 1965 and 1975, if memory serves. And, keggers were also this, kind of controversial thing where like parents, you would hear about, high school kids or early college kids, they go off into the woods. This is like the movie Dazed and Confused, if you've seen it. They're going off in the woods, they're drinking all this beer, they're doing it kind of clandestine. And every once in a while the cops would show up, but it was like a game of whack-a-mole. The cops show up, they flash their lights, all the drinkers scatter into the woods. If the cops catch any, they're lucky. So that's going on. And that's kind of like putting a bit of a, putting a bit of a lens on the entire practice. And then you combine that with the fact that drinking laws were changing drastically during the 1970s. In the kind of post-student protests era, the late 1960s, early 1970s, about 28 states lowered their drinking law from usually about 21 down to something like 18 or 19. Montana lowers theirs to 19 first, and then a year later they lowered down to 18. So a lot of these people, are 18-year-olds who a couple years ago would have been, illegal drinkers. Now they're suddenly legal. There's a lot of this like kind of gray foam surrounding the rise of keggers in general and the library kegger in particular, as it kind of gains all this traction and makes all this money for the University of Montana Library.
What was the movement to lower the drinking age? Because it kind of bounced back. I mean, when I turned 18, I felt lucky I could drink it at 18. Mm-hmm. And very quickly it bounced back up to 21. How did it go down to 18 in the first place?
Well, we're talking about 28 states. There's going to be a bit of variation in the reasoning, but generally speaking, that student protests kind of trend that I was talking about, a lot of that was focused on, the counterculture movement, anti-war, anti-Vietnam War sentiment. But it had a lot more general applicability, and it leads to, the constitutional amendment during that period that lowers the voting age down to 18 nationwide. And so a lot of the slogan for that, again, it was tied to anti-war protests. So the slogan surrounding, the push for that constitutional amendment was, well, hey, old enough to fight, old enough to be drafted in the military, old enough to vote. But then an offshoot of that very quickly became, well, if I'm old enough to vote, I'm old enough to drink, or at least I should be. And so that's where a lot of that impetus came from. And again, not every single state, followed down that path, but quite a few of them did. And it very much kind of changed the nature of youth drinking in the United States, basically throughout the entire 1970s. And then, as we all know, in the 1980s, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, all that stuff, it kind of bounced back towards the 21 age.
Cody, I know so Brian wrote the article that I'm referencing, but you're also writing an article. 70s and drinking law, University of Montana. I mean, were there dry campuses? What was it like in the 70s in Montana?
Yeah, Montana was decidedly not a dry state in any sort of sense. I think it was, by the end of the 70s, I think Montana is the fourth state in the nation in terms of per capita beer consumption. It's up there, and the state has had a pretty kind of robust drinking culture at the time. And the 18-year drinking age was also in effect in the state for most of those years. And kind of not coincidentally, it gets raised by the state legislature back up to 19 in 1979, which is also the final year of the Kegger, because there was pushback gradually, which basically came from the fact that, seniors in high school could drink now. And they would just drinking. And they were drinking. Yeah. And they would just hang out outside the school or just across the street from the school where they could legally drink, and they would do so. And a lot of people worried about the influence that was having on younger kids. And they were worried about these keg parties that teens were throwing in kind of far off places, and they were drinking and driving. And there'd be a handful of kind of accidents that would happen that would get a lot of press. So there was, even in Montana, which had a very, very lax attitude toward drinking that lasted, well into that persists to this day, frankly. Montana didn't have an open container law for driving until 2005, So even there was pushback against the 18-year-old drinking law, just because the high school component of it all.
Well, that's a great intro. But Brian, what led you to write this article? Because I know you've written a couple other really interesting history, beer-related articles.
Yeah, I'm always on the lookout for just kind of interesting little vignettes in beer history, interesting little episodes that allow you to use beer to say something more. And so one of the previous articles and podcasts I wrote in collaboration with another journalist named Holly Regan had to do with the Coors boycotts. And it was based in large part on a recent book written by Professor Alison Brantley at the University of La Verne. The book's called Brewing a Boycott. I suggest everyone Google it, get it from your library or something. It's a fantastic book about the history of the Coors boycotts in the United States. And over the course of that research, Professor Brantley has like a couple of paragraphs about Aber Day, in her book. And then while we were actually talking while researching the article, she kept saying over and over, this is a really fascinating topic. I wish I'd had more space to devote to it. Wish I had more time to look into it, all that kind of stuff. And so, I put it on my back burner and came around to it eventually. And the more I looked into it, the more fascinating of a story it became. And you can read what the result was.
So for some of our younger listeners, can you just refresh everyone about what the Coors boycott was?
Sure. So the Coors boycotts was one of the largest consumer grassroots boycott movements of the 20th century. So if anyone is familiar with Fox News, I wonder if anyone who listens to this is familiar with Fox News. Fox News is its history is very much connected to the Heritage Foundation, a think tank based out of Washington, D.C. that is very pro-conservative. That Heritage Foundation was spearheaded and founded with large reliance on money from the Coors family, particularly Joe Coors. And even before that, the Coors family, through their brewery in Golden, Colorado, had a very strong history of opposing union organizations, of, I'll say, alleged discriminatory practices in their workplace, things like that. And so basically from the 1960s through the 1980s, there was a series of interconnected boycott movements from various sources, from community groups, from racial interest groups, from protest groups, and most often from labor unions that were trying to get people to boycott Coors beer for one or many of its alleged abuses. And it culminated, actually, its culmination is in the late 1970s, and it has a relation to the Aber Day Kegger, which we can definitely talk to as part of this broadcast. So it's a fascinating story that spans the entire Western United States and more. It spans so many different community interest groups, especially LGBTQ plus groups, as well as Latinx or Hispanic community groups. The preferred term for that community changes, so I don't want to leave anybody out. But it's an absolutely fascinating story, and Professor Brantley's book is the most comprehensive coverage of it that I've seen to date, and it's definitely the latest work.
Yeah, I remember. I grew up on the East Coast and came of age, and I think I remember hearing about, not to buy Coors. I don't think I quite understood it at that time why. Mm-hmm. Cody, when you've written and studied about education, are these kind of movements and student movements something that you're interested in?
Yeah, I mean, any sort of student activism is always kind of exciting fodder for historians of education, right? Because this is one of the few times you can really see students in the historical record in a big way. Often they kind of go unheard or unnoticed unless they're sort of making noise about something, right? So these are really big flashpoint moments for a lot of different reasons. And, in the story of the Kegger, you have that coming from a lot of different directions, right? This was an event started by students. It was itself kind of like this entrepreneurial venture and with the intent of helping the university. It was a charitable effort led by students that, at least initially, the university actually kind of embraced, and the broader community, to some extent, embraced it as well. And by the end of the Kegger's run, there's kind of different forms of student activism popping up around it, specifically students who are sympathetic to the Coors boycott become kind of hostile to the Kegger in its final year because they award the beer contracts to Coors. That's kind of how these two stories tie together. And there's a lot more to that we can get deeper into as well. But yeah, so by the end of the Kegger, you have kind of two different factions of students who both see themselves as sort of doing righteous work, right? You have the students who are kind of organizing the Kegger, who say like, oh, we're doing this event for the university. It supports the library. And you have these other universities who are kind of acting in sympathy with the Coors boycott, saying like, you can't, like, our consumer choices as students also matter. We can't just sort of support these companies that are also hurting people in the region, right? So yeah, it's kind of a collision of different forms of student activism, I suppose you could say.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brian, in your article, I really like the evolution of the Kegger.
Yeah.
How it started out, and it's a couple of things that I smiled at, because I've done a lot of beer festivals. The daisy chain of kegs.
Yeah.
Was that something new, or did the Kegger people figure that out, or did they get it from the beer distributor?
Boy, you got me. That's something I would like to know myself. I just know that it was really innovative. So what Jimmy's talking about is when in the later years, the middle and later years of the Kegger, they went to a spot, a rodeo grounds that was near Missoula, and that's what they would kind of rent out to hold the Kegger. It was a big enough space, and because it's rodeo grounds, there's corrals in it for horses and cattle and things like that. And so they use these corrals to kind of organize the Kegger. They would literally kind of feed attendees through like cattle. The attendees would literally moo sometimes because they knew very much what was happening. And yeah, on one side of the fence, you'd have all the people that were trying to get beer, and they would literally like nail a big board, to just for the day. And they had had holes in it for all the taps to go, like 30 some taps. And all those taps would snake into like a feed trough or like a stock tank. And you'd have 3 kegs in that stock tank and then filled with ice to keep it cold or whatever. And then behind that, you would have like 2 to 4 more kegs connected in series. So that literally, the back keg was feeding into the one in front of it and so on until it got to the tap. And that was really innovative and useful for that event, because if the back keg kicked, you could switch it out and replace it without ever interrupting flow at the front of the tap. And you really didn't have time to interrupt flow with these taps because there were up to 10,000 people there. They didn't even turn off the taps. They just let them flow, and people would just, put their cup under it and then keep going. And yeah, so it was just this really kind of, it was like this island of beer kegs, in the corral surrounded by all these people around it. And then they'd have like fraternity members who would get hired for the day. I don't know if they were paid in money or in beer, but they were okay with it either way. And, they're sitting there, empty kegs, they're flipping them back. Full kegs, they're rolling them between their legs in a chain to get them back out, and it's all just coming off this big pickup truck. It was probably it was an amazing sight to see, but also surprisingly well organized. Like Cody's saying, the organizers took it really seriously, and they very much like approached it with good faith and seriousness. I mean, not that they wouldn't enjoy some of the fruits of their labor when time allowed, but yet they very much put the event first, and it wasn't just some ad hoc or haphazard thing. It was a well-oiled machine, especially in those later years.
Wow. What are some other innovations that came out of this event? You mentioned something about the half-gallon pitcher.
Yeah. The first year or the first couple of years, they were drinking Olympia beer. And so I think they were using like little paper cups that were provided by the distributor, or things like that. And, as you can imagine, it's unlimited beer and a bunch of college students, and, they get handed one paper cup at a time. There was probably a mountain of paper cups at the end of the day, just a giant mess. And so in later years, they came up with kind of the half-gallon pitcher that it was like a souvenir that like everyone got as part of their admission. And firstly, that cuts down on waste, and it also cuts down on repeat, line attendance, right? Because it takes a little bit longer to get through that container. It also, I think, symbolized just the excess of the event. I mean, it's unlimited beer. It's all you can drink. And, people were drinking as much as they could. I'm surprised no one burst.
Cody, is it still mythic to you? I mean, do you wish you'd been able to be part of it?
Oh, yeah. I went to college at the University of Montana, and, I lived there for 7 years. And that's one of these things that when you learn about this, the first thing you ask is like, why don't we still do this? Why isn't this still happening? How did that end in the 70s? Like, we should have this right now. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, to people from that community, it has taken on a very kind of mythic air to it. And there's a ton of nostalgia surrounding the Kegger. In recent years, they've done like reunions, not at the old site, but kind of in nearby towns. They've put together kind of reunion music festivals kind of to pay tribute to the spirit of the original Kegger. But of course, it's not the same. It's not like they have the same amount of people. Most of the people going are older now. They're people who remember the original character and they're kind of the Kegger and are reliving their glory days. So
it's like going to a Rolling Stones concert now.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it totally has a kind of mythic air about it in Missoula. And I just have to say about the beer pitchers, there's kind of a funny tangential story related to those from one of the earlier Keggers. A week after the Kegger in 1974, the Grateful Dead played in Missoula. And they played in the basketball arena in the field house on campus. And right before the encore, someone in the crowd had brought their Kegger pitcher into the event, and they threw it on stage, and it hit Bob Weir in the head. And so the Grateful Dead played a short song in their encore, and then they cut it short. And then there was a reaction in the student newspapers where students were writing in and saying, these idiots came and just embarrassed us in front of the Grateful Dead by acting like this concert was like the Kegger, and throwing the pitcher on stage. So, even after the Kegger, it sort of had an effect on things that were happening around town. The hangover, I guess you could say, lasted after the event itself was over.
Brian, talk about beer styles. So Olympia was the beer. How did they get involved? And what style of beer is Olympia or was Olympia?
I will answer that, but first can I add a quick anecdote to Cody's because it's very, very related, and I think very, very funny. Okay, so when it comes to the throwing pitchers thing, that wasn't the only time that happened. I want to say it was 1976. There was another artist performing who I won't name because I think that their performance wasn't going particularly well that time. I think they were having some sound problems, and I also think that they may have imbibed a little bit before getting on stage. I don't know for sure, but the performance wasn't going particularly well. And so, as you might expect, someone in the crowd threw their pitcher up at the stands and hit the performer on their person and they were not happy about it and they were already in a bad mood. They're like, oh, I'm done. And they just walk off stage. And, as you can imagine, the crowd wanted music and people were kind of scrambling to figure out what to do. And so another band kind of came out on the stage, kind of impromptu, started trying to win over the crowd a little bit again. And I don't know if the crowd wasn't satisfied or what, or there was just one nut in the crowd, but someone else threw a second pitcher right at him, right onto the stage. I don't think it hit the performer, but the performer was like, all right, yeah, fine, whatever. He just picked it up. He threw it right back, gave a smile to the crowd. The crowd was all happy. He won over the crowd, got back to it. That artist was Jimmy Buffett with his Coral Reefer Band. And that was one of their early performances. That was before Margaritaville. That was before they really hit it big. And some of his later albums, there's some lyrics in a Jimmy Buffett song whose title escapes me, where he kind of credits Missoula and the Kegger for helping launch his career. And I think a moment like that was probably really pivotal in doing it. So to all the pitcher throwers out there, stop it, but I salute you.
What about Olympia?
Yes, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, Olympia beer. So that goes back to the 1972, the first Kegger. The organizers, particularly Clark Hansen, they were pulling together everyone they knew to put together the Kegger. Bands that they knew, and those bands knew other bands, things like that. One of Clark's fraternity brothers, I believe, had a connection to Earl Sharon, who was the local distributor for Olympia beer in Missoula. And so he was willing to kind of give them beer on contingency. So hell of a risk considering the Kegger hadn't ever happened before and they didn't know what was going to happen. And Earl Sharon just developed a really close relationship with them and provided Oli beer every single year except for that last one, the 1979 one where they ultimately went with Coors. And I don't know if it was just, the personal relationship was that strong or he was just giving them that good of a deal or whatever, but it worked out really well. It really helped kind of grow the brand in that region. Olympia was putting advice on how to get other colleges to form their own keggers in its distributor newsletter, things like that. But as for what the beer was, I mean, it was Olympia's standard lager. So, this is before the takeover of light lagers, Miller Lite and Coors Light, but it was still very much like that adjunct lager type of beer. And they only served one kind because, when you're serving that much in that form, you're not going to be asking people what they want. You're just going to, here, put your bucket under the tap and fill it up, was very much the mentality. So yeah, it was just kind of standard Oli beer. So Olympia's equivalent of Coors Banquet or Budweiser or whatever.
So you're saying that in that time, like 1972, the drinking age went down, and the breweries and distributors started pivoting to the 18, 19-year-olds.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they descended like vultures as best they could. They don't necessarily want to talk about that era in their marketing strategy anymore if they can help it.
Yeah, no, I think it's been erased. It's pretty much 21 plus, and I've never even done a show that's even talked about 18 as a drinking age. I don't think I even knew that it went from 21 to 18 in some states. You're used to hearing about Europe and other places where people can drink at 18 or 16 or something like that. Yeah. So that's a little deeper on history, which I want to talk to you about some of your other articles because you overlap with politics and places like Milwaukee and lagers. Cody, how has Missoula changed? So tell us about Missoula. So, it talk about the first fest. It's all dusty. It was from all the beer pouring, it's beer mud. What's the climate like? I've never been to Montana, but I don't really know what Missoula is either.
Yeah, well, so Missoula in a lot of ways is kind of a classic American college town. Obviously, the university and the culture of the university is really important to just kind of the general vibe of the town. The University of Montana, too, being the kind of flagship university in the state. Like a lot of other states, you name it, like the University of Wisconsin and Madison, people have certain associations with how Madison relates to the rest of Wisconsin, or Boulder, where the University of Colorado is in Colorado, right? They just have kind of a distinct vibe from the rest of the state in a lot of ways, both when it comes to the kind of the youth culture there and the politics of the city and all that stuff, right? And that the same thing is true of Missoula in a lot of ways. And Missoula is one of the larger cities in the state. I think during the 70s, it would have been maybe the third largest city in Montana, which, at the time was like 50,000 people, maybe even less than that, right? Today it's bigger. It's kind of grown. It's probably closer to 90,000 people. And it's still the second largest city in Montana. And this is the kind of thing that we as Montanans complain about, is the population's out of control and we just jumped over 1 million people, So again, it's in context, right? But yeah, and so Missoula's in the northwestern part of the state. It's kind of tucked into this kind of little mountain valley. Two rivers run really close by town, so the river culture is sort of important to the city, right? Really outdoorsy. And again, college kids, it's kind of always been sort of something of a party town. And that's pretty pivotal to what it is. And, it's kind of like a countercultural hippie town as well. But because it's Montana, it also has plenty of, just people from rural parts of the state. The cowboy culture is still strong there in some ways. I mean, after all, the Kegger was held on the rodeo grounds, right? So it kind of contains multitudes like the state itself. And that also kind of part of the story of the Kegger is the weather in early May in Montana is highly variable, right? You're not guaranteed nice days. And so quite a few of the stories are just about how terrible the weather was, right? Often it's rainy or cold, you just can't really count on a beautiful sunshiny day in early May in Montana. So that's also part of the story of the vibe of the Kegger.
Hey, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a few minutes on Beer Sessions Radio. Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. It's our 15th year. Join us and support at heritageradionetwork.org. I'm Jimmy Carboni, and we're talking with Cody and Brian about the original Kegger in Missoula, Montana, and some other history. So, Brian and Cody, you guys are both writing about this original Kegger, but in different ways. So what are your sources? How did you go about researching? You want to start, Brian?
Yeah. So, I relied a lot on kind of newspaper sources, but not the same ones that Cody's going to talk about, which he'll cover, of course. There's the Daily Missoulian in that town, and that just provided a ton of commentary about the Kegger kind of as it unfolded, and it was it was a useful perspective because it was the perspective of people not from the university. We're not just hearing from the students who are organizing it or students who attended, but from local residents or local community groups who didn't always love the Kegger. The rodeo grounds where they would hold it were in this area called Miller Creek, which I believe is to the south of Missoula. Please correct me on that if I'm wrong. And, as you can imagine, 10,000 20-somethings getting as drunk as they possibly can, on a certain day of the year, especially when you have work on that day or your kids are going to school. And, this isn't a huge city where there's tons and tons of access. There's maybe one or two primary roads in and out. And when there's a 3-mile line of cars trying to get to a Kegger that are blocking your kid's school bus and all that kind of stuff, there were people who literally drove their pickup trucks or motorcycles through people's yards. These yards varied from, what you might expect for a single family home yard to ranches. Or larger pieces of property or whatever, but people are driving their cars through, they're walking through because they're stuck in traffic and they just drank a lot of beer. They're getting out and taking a whiz on your plants. In one particular case, there was a drunk person who I don't know where he thought he was, but he was pounding on this woman's door. This woman has her kids at home, and it's just her and her kids. She's obviously scared out of her mind. This guy breaks down the door. She takes her kids and flees out the back door and goes and calls the cops somewhere. And when the cops arrive, this guy's passed out on her couch. So, that kind of stuff could happen now and then. And, it's just those type of sources make it into the newspaper. And you combine that with some firsthand testimony that you get from a documentary that was made by the Kegger organizers in 2009. You get little bits of scholarship here and there that mention it. All those kind of sources paint a pretty good picture of what was going on and what people liked and didn't like about the Kegger from year to year. But even then, it wasn't the entire picture. Cody found quite a bit of sources that I did not have access to, and it allowed him to really show a side of the story that I wasn't able to touch on. So I think Cody should cover that.
Yeah, and my specific interest in this, as I kind of mentioned before, was I was interested in the last year of the Kegger, and I was kind of thinking about how it ended and why it ended. Those were the main questions that were guiding the research I did. Watching the documentary that came out about the Kegger in 2009, and this aired on Montana PBS, and you can still buy DVD copies of it online, and it's a fun watch. Like, if you want to know more about the Kegger, that's one of the first things I would tell people to do is track down that DVD. If you still have a DVD player, that is. The sort of story of the end of the Kegger that gets told in that is it gets glossed over a little. It was like, well, it was time to wrap it up. It was the end of the 70s. And I suppose to an extent you could say that's true. But I found a couple other documents that were just pointing to some of these different controversies that were happening surrounding the Kegger that year. And that really piqued my interest. And as Brian mentioned, there's kind of a community-wide controversy going around, right? Where there's people on council members in the city who are really against the event because of the sort of their view that it's just causing drunken chaos in the city, and it's endangering people because you have all these drunk kids driving out on the road. There's also a pretty healthy contingent of people in the community who think it's just hurting the campus's reputation. The University of Montana is losing enrollment throughout the 1970s, right? And it's struggling, especially compared to its counterpart, Montana State University down in Bozeman, which is the land grant university, the kind of agricultural school. It's kind of viewed as the more sober, of the two institutions. Though, I mean, come on, it was still a college in Montana, but
so maybe they dealt with science, plant breeding, or something.
Yeah, it's like agricultural stuff. Yeah, it's like, I don't know.
It's natural.
Where was my train of thought going? Oh, yeah. I was getting to the student part of this. So really, one of the things I focused on the most in my research was what was the discussion that was happening in the student newspaper throughout 1979 about the Kegger. Because it was really fascinating just to see how the students themselves were discussing a lot of these issues. And they were really centered on a couple of different things. One being, is the Kegger hurting our school's reputation? Obviously, students have a vested interest in their school being perceived well by the general public, right? I mean, you want your school to be successful. You want the degree you get to have value to people out in the world, right? So students were kind of acutely aware of this perception that people saw the University of Montana as this place where people just went to kind of party and smoke pot and, participate in various forms of student activism, right? But then there's also this issue around the Coors boycott that arises because the group that organizes the Kegger awards the contract in that final year to Coors. And that basically happens because they bid the contract out to various people. So Coors and Olympia, which was the usual, and Rainier, another kind of staple Northwestern beer. These are all the kind of people that are bidding on this, right? Coors really wants this contract because, as Brian was alluding to, this is a really lucrative market, these college students. And especially when you're talking about an event that the year before, served 1,000 kegs of beer to 10,000 attendees. Like that's incredible advertising for your company. So Coors kind of pulls out all the stops to try to get this contract. They say they're going to bring in a hot air balloon. They're going to film some of the proceedings. They're going to use the Kegger in like advertising for the brand. They really try to get this. And of course, the people who are listening to these pitches, the people who are the head of the organization that puts the Kegger together, they sort of claim that, well, this was a completely apolitical move, right? They weren't really thinking about the politics of the breweries when they were doing this. But the reaction to this is so swift from the students that you kind of wonder how that could be true necessarily, right? How they couldn't be aware of what the backlash to choosing Coors might be. Because it is really swift. And there's immediately a ton of conversation in the student newspaper from students and other professors on the campus who sort of view the Coors choice as kind of, it's a bridge too far. And they're saying we should organize a student boycott to go along with, in sympathy with the larger Coors boycott. So these are conversations that are sort of happening in the months leading up to that final Kegger. Like, is there going to be a boycott? Are enough people going to come? Like, what's going to happen? So
can I just add, as Cody's saying, the organizers choose Coors. They choose, the Kegger's in like May or June, as the timing allows, but they're making this selection of the beer for the event. They make it in February. And I point that out because 2 months before that particular February, in December of 1978, Coors had finally successfully broken a massive year-long strike at its Golden, Colorado plant that was very high profile, and that was very like concerning for the reputation of the company. And it was like the focal point of these boycotts that Cody's talking about. This happens literally 2 months before MLAC, the organizing body, makes this decision. And so it's not just that, Coors is hoping for an advertising boon. They're also hoping to really kind of paper over this PR problem that they're having. And it also kind of underscores why it's really hard to imagine that they would have been unaware of the politics of the situation when it was so fresh in everyone's mind. And even adding on top of that one more time, all these boycotters who weren't just located in Golden, Colorado, that this boycott had like arms and cells and local organizations all around the West. They were obviously, now that the union was busted and the strike was broken in Golden, they were looking for something new to latch onto to focus the boycott on. And it's not that Missoula became a nationwide focal point, but if you were anywhere near in Montana or anywhere near Missoula and wanted to like find a way to continue the boycott, this was just a great opportunity to latch onto. And so that, I think that helps explain, why it was so political, why there was such an immediate backlash, and why this idea that like, oh, well, we were just making a business decision doesn't really hold water.
Yeah, and much like the beer companies are targeting college-age drinkers, the boycott movement was also targeting colleges, right, as like potential sites where they could gain support. And the Kegger and the success of this boycott movement, it was really one of the first pieces of evidence they had that this could be a viable strategy, that universities could be a good place to organize support for the boycott. Because, just to kind of explain what happens, the organizers basically drop Coors like a week before the Kegger. The pressure.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so it's sort of this.
So
ends,
they didn't use Coors after all.
Yeah, it ends sort of dramatically and in sort of a surprise fashion, because there's there's rumors that there's going to be a picket at the event, and certain people in the community are sort of saying, oh well, there could be violence, which there's really no evidence that could have happened or was in the cards at all. But there's a lot of that conversation that's sort of happening in the media about sort of, well, what could go wrong if they actually have this picket and if there's this boycott. And also the other thing that was happening was sort of the advanced ticket sales seemingly were a little low. And it might have been a last ditch effort to get more people to come to the Kegger. And so, they switched and they gave it to the second highest bidder, who that year was Rainier. So they did end up serving a different beer than Olympia that year, but it was just Rainier instead of Coors, which, mollified a lot of people who were involved with the boycott movement. And there were some conciliatory letters written into the student newspaper saying like, hey, they did the right thing. We don't have to boycott this anymore. But certainly there were still a lot of people in the community who saw that they made that initial choice and they were like, no, we don't want to deal with this group anymore. We're done with this event, right? So it did poison the well to some extent.
Yep. Made for one happy Rainier distributor, though.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So Brian, in some of your other writing, you guys please jump in whenever you want. and I'm sure there's more anecdotes. You're talking about politics and beer and all this stuff, coming of age and getting your beers into the young group, early on and things. What's this another story not from this that you want to let people know about?
You mean that relates to youth drinking, or just in general?
or anything with politics and any of your other articles. I'd like to talk about some of the other things you write about, because
sure,
you really go pretty deep, and I like it.
That's what I love to do. I love to really dig into topics that kind of use beer to be a good chaser to the history. So you don't just feel like you're consuming something that's really dry and unpleasant or boring. It's actually a surprisingly interesting topic, and I use beer to help demonstrate that. I mean, I've covered all sorts of things. My specialty is originally in the 19th century. That's why I've talked about courtrooms that where there were court cases literally trying to decide whether beer can get you drunk, because that was apparently a question. I've talked about working class riots in 1840s Munich over a half Kreutzer rise in the price of beer. And a half Kreutzer, because I'm sure you all have your exchange charts in front of you, was about 1/3 of 1 cent per beer increase in price, and it led to a 3-day riot in Munich. I've talked about the effect of the 1918 flu pandemic, as well as the rise of the Prohibition movement on the bar scene in Milwaukee. I've talked about the way that beer was used to reinstall white supremacy in post-Civil War Charleston. I mean, I've gone all over the place. It's a lot of fun. So yeah, I don't know what's tickling you out of what I said.
Well, just since we're talking about lagers, I did look at your article about Milwaukee in the 19th century and how their beers really became popular in Chicago. And let's talk. That's still Midwestern. Let's talk about that.
Sure.
Because I'm into lagers. A week and a half ago, I was at the Pills and Love Fest in Brooklyn, and I'm thinking about old fashioned style lagers.
Oh, lagers are due for a renaissance. I mean, they're experiencing a renaissance. Lots of fantastic lagers out there, but it's very deserved, and I hope it keeps going. That article was all about kind of this weird little like half myth around Chicago, where the idea is that Chicago didn't really have as much of a beer scene because Milwaukee brewers like Schlitz or Pabst or what have you were kind of so close that they just kind of flooded the market. And especially after the Chicago Fire, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, when a huge chunk of the city burns down, the idea was that, these Milwaukee brewers just swooped in and took all the market share. And that's why Chicago didn't develop its own really robust beer scene. And that's not entirely true. In some ways it is, but it's not the way that it's told. Chicago did have a robust beer scene. The largest brewery in the country, and for a short time in the 1870s was Conrad Sipes Brewing Company out of Chicago. They were kind of competing with what is it? The big one that was in New York City that I cannot. Oh, I'm embarrassing myself right now. Ehret Brewing Company. George Ehret Brewing Company in the 19th century in New York. And if you've never heard of Ehret's and you've never heard of Conrad Sipe, that's because beer history is a little bit slanted. We always think about these big national breweries like Budweiser, and we don't think about the breweries that got really big, but they didn't get really widespread because a big city like New York City has a lot of stomach to drink beer. Chicago was the same way. So these big brewing companies were very large, but they never had reason to leave home. Anyway, that's a tangent, but that article was all about how Milwaukee slowly made inroads into Chicago, but it very much had to compete with a local scene. And when it came to the time when Milwaukee really did start, getting big, Milwaukee Brewers got really big, not the baseball team, but the actual Brewers. When they started getting really big and they started relying on Chicago, it wasn't in the way that we think. It wasn't just that, we're going to make all Chicago drinkers drink our beer. It was more, we're going to use Chicago railroads to launch everywhere, because Chicago was this giant railroad hub. And Pabst would try so hard to get Chicago drinkers on board, but they weren't doing it because it made them a lot of money in Chicago. They were doing it because it would get people in the hinterlands, people in Southern Illinois, people in Indiana, people in rural Michigan to drink Pabst as well, because it was Chicago railroads feeding all of those communities. So in Chicago, Pabst would basically give beer away because they needed the prestige. But then in various small towns throughout the rest of the Midwest, they'd be making like full $1.50, $2 a keg profits, which that's in 19th century money. That's a lot of money per keg. That's maybe like 40-50% profit, something like that. But it's in all these little towns where they're reaping huge profits per keg. So even though it's a smaller volume, it's huge profits. And that's why they're willing to basically give beer away at cost in Chicago, as long as they could make sure it was getting on the railroads and make sure it was getting in all, getting talked about and get, all that kind of stuff. And, since we're gathered today to talk about the Aber Day Kegger, it was kind of the same deal with college advertising. Something, a sponsorship like the Aber Day Kegger, with Coors getting it or Oli getting it, they weren't making a lot of money at that event. That wasn't a profit-driven event. What Coors wanted was pictures of college students drinking that beer so they could make advertisements out of it. They wanted those kids to take home posters to hang in their dorm rooms, and all that kind of stuff. And that was actually that wasn't just about that one kegger. That was the entire strategy for college marketing for big breweries back in those days when the drinking age was 18 and when you could get away with a lot more college advertising without getting, let's say, fined for the trouble. But it wasn't about making tons of money at keggers or at the fun runs that were sponsored by Budweiser or Coors or whatever. It was about getting posters into dorm rooms. It was about getting people talking about it. It was about getting them to order Coors when they go out to the bar later rather than at that event. So, very similar marketing strategies, even though it doesn't necessarily look that way, in hindsight.
Yeah. Cody?
I'm sorry for my rant. I will get going.
No, that's why you're on. That's what you got hired for, Brian.
What was the question?
There's no question. It's just trying to bring it all back to the kegger.
Oh, yeah.
And then I really want to go and talk about old style lagers. That's what I want to talk about. Because when you said Pabst, and I'm thinking 19th century, it's like there's a brewery in Brooklyn called Transmitter, and they have people call this a pre-prohibition lager. And there's something about it. It's a little crisp. It's got some malt. You think about what happened in like 1840, 1850. All these German breweries were opening in the Midwest, and it just changed the world. It changed what people drank. It changed how they socialized. I know you wrote about that a little bit. You had a very cool post about German lagers and how it was winning everyone over and all that kind of stuff. But when you think about beer, let's take it back to this lager. Imagine being in Missoula in those years. I think about being a student and just craving that cold beer. I don't know if you have experiential things to talk about with beer, but now I'm just craving. I got a New Hampshire beer in front of me, a Czech style dark lager from Northwoods, and I'm about to crack. So I'm thinking about having a beer.
Well, it's really interesting to think about this period in the 70s where you have all these kind of regional breweries jockeying for these beer bids to do these big events. And yeah, as Brian was mentioning, it's just like they're serving one beer to this large group, right? It's like the whatever this sort of company's base lager or ale is, that's what's on tap. And it's mainly popular for its sort of absence of flavor or taste, right? It was kind of funny with the student reaction to Coors, where there's just a few of them who are like, yeah, what I was pretty upset about with the Coors bid was I just don't like Coors, or, it's too light or something like that. And the same thing happens when Rainier gets the bid. There's people who just write letters to the campus newspaper to say like, oh, well, it's good that they dumped Coors, but Rainier really sucks, So it's just funny how those things happen. It's just long before there's any sort of semblance of a craft beer scene in the Northwest, right? Which now it's huge, right? I mean, the first craft brewery in Missoula opens, I think, at the very end of the 80s. and it's still open. It's called Bayern Brewing, and they do German beers. They do lagers.
They're very good.
So yeah, it's an excellent brewery. So to bring it back to the lager conversation, there is a tie-in with Missoula there too. So
I can add a little to the lager conversation and still keep it centered on the kegger. So except for that last year, Olympia beer was the beer of choice. And so Olympia beer, so I'm based in Washington State, by the way. I don't think that's been mentioned yet. But anyway, Olympia beer is also based from near Olympia, Washington, Tumwater, Washington to be exact. So it's from my neck of the woods, or so to speak. And there's a smaller brewery there called Well 80 Brewing that I totally recommend if anyone's ever in that region. I'd even recommend traveling a little bit to get there. Well 80 is a very good brewery, and it's based in Tumwater, where Olympia was. And so Olympia has like a reputation in that town because it used to get made there. And there's still people there who used to work for the brewery, even though it's been closed for a number of years. And Well 80 was also able to get in touch with one of their brewmasters from the final years of the brewery. So today you can buy Olympia beer at the grocery store. I'm not sure exactly where it's distributed, but at least by me, you can. And I'm just going to make an opinion. It's not very good. It's really watery. The brand is now owned by Pabst, and because Pabst vacuumed up a whole bunch of regional brands, in the 80s and things like that. It's just it's not very good, in my opinion. And so, but the cool thing about Well 80 is because they were able to get in touch with this former brewmaster. They were able to do some historical research, and they can actually produce classic Olympia beer. So one thing that was fantastic when I was visiting them and talking with the brewer is they were able to just give me a side-by-side comparison. They pulled out a can of off the grocery store shelf Olympia. They put it next to it. They poured one of their own varieties, which was based on a 1964 recipe for Olympia beer, functionally the same beer, but a slightly different recipe because they get tweaked. And then next to that, they were able to put a third glass, which was the original 1894 recipe for Olympia beer. And I was able to try all three in at the same time. And it's funny, they're like cousins of each other. It's very clearly the same beer, the same recipe, but just the newer one is kind of bland. I don't care for it. The 1964 one was like this middle child, like much more robust, much more like flavorful and interesting. And the 1894 one, a pre-prohibition lager, was surprisingly, it was really refreshing. It was good. It was this wonderful beer. And so the point of all this is one, when the Kegger attendees were drinking Olympia beer, it's not the same as you might get today. Because all these macro brands, well, lots of beer recipes, but among the macro brands, the recipes get tweaked all the time and they get changed for marketing reasons or for economic reasons, whatever. And so probably the 1964 version that I tasted was probably the closest to what was being drunk at the Kegger. And that was actually a pretty good beer, I think. It's a light lager, like it's that style of beer. And I guess it's your opinion whether you like that kind of beer, but it was a decent quality beer that I really respected. In contrast to what you might get at the grocery store shelf today. And so, these things really do change over time, but just because it was like one beer and just because it was, what would be considered like a macro brand in the kind of today's terms, doesn't mean that, what you're buying off the shelf is like, oh, this is what they're drinking at the Kegger, because it's not necessarily that type of equation. And it's an eye-opening experience to kind of think that way and to realize, I think that even the beers that we don't think change over time do change over time. The idea that, what we think our grandfathers were drinking isn't what we're buying at the store shelf today, even if it's Budweiser or High Life or whatever the brand is.
Well, then things like whenever that was, the late 70s when, Miller Lite came out, the idea of the light lager definitely watered things down, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I love talking about 1894 lagers. I'm thinking about Ron Pattinson in England who would go back and look at a lot of historical recipes, and we had some brewers in New York that would make some of them. And I guess the big fact is that in World War One, just because of supplies and restrictions, the malt bill got thinned.
Yep.
So you started having lower gravity beers, and that was just one major change. And then it changes taste as well. So if you were drinking 1894 versus 19 post-prohibition, I'm sure you had a completely different beer as well, even in England.
Yeah.
I don't know if you go how deep you go into that, Brian. I think it would be cool when you do your articles to somehow find some other historical differences in the beers and things like that, because there's a lot of brewers that looking for the challenge of making an old recipe.
Absolutely. Yeah. Something like Prohibition, it's 13 years of having the proverbial tap turned off. It's going to throw everyone's taste perceptions into a blender. And on the other side of it, yeah, I mean, the beer that started getting made after Prohibition ended was not the same beer that had been made beforehand. And part of that was just because people's taste expectations had changed, in those 13 years, Yeah.
One more story that you wrote about, you were talking about how during Prohibition, there was a U.S. shipping magnate who was able to sell beer on his American ships.
Yes.
Is that controversial?
Oh, absolutely. The person we're talking about is Albert Lasker, who was a big advertising guru. It's not the 1960s, but think Don Draper, like the Mad Men type of archetype, just set in the 1910s instead of the 1960s. This guy literally invented orange juice. Like, I'm not even making that up. He came up with the idea for orange juice as a way to sell oranges. He was also one of the people that would say, like, tell women to smoke cigarettes to stay thin. So this is not a good person. But anyway, his name's Albert Lasker. And basically, as a favor to President Warren Harding in the late in the 1920s, pardon me, the early 1920s, as a favor to him, as part of getting Warren Harding elected, he's given control of the United States Shipping Board, which was a very large organization at the time that basically handled all non-military shipping in the United States, passenger ships, cargo ships, things like that. And he was basically tasked with taking this gargantuan, capsized, if you'll forgive the pun, organization and turning it around, because that's what he did. He was a businessman who knew how to turn things around and make, thread into gold. So he's tasked with doing this, and he has this giant shipping fleet that he has to turn profitable, but it's Prohibition. And he basically reasons out that the only way he's going to be able to, to get the books in the black for this organization is to sell liquor on the ships. And so he starts selling it outside of U.S. territorial waters. So these are ships flying the U.S. flag, but they're outside of technical U.S. jurisdiction. And he uses this as a gray area to get away with it for a year. It's incredibly it's a risky, controversial thing. No one thinks he should be doing this. No one's told him that this is okay. He just kind of does it. And then whenever anyone asks about it, he just kind of changes the subject. And it's amazing that he gets away with this for about a year. But then finally in, I want to say 1922, August Bush takes a sea voyage from the United States to Germany, because he literally has a castle there because he's a Bush. And and he notices that once they're out of U.S. territory, that these literally 5 bars on the ship open up, and they're selling beer among other types of liquor. And he's like, well, how come I can't produce beer, but you're buying this European beer and serving it, and you're literally an arm of the United States government? And I want to stress that these are U.S. government ships. These are not privately owned passenger ships flying the United States flag. No, the U.S. Shipping Board is literally, it owns the ships. So anyway, because Bush has access to a gigantic advertising arm, despite the fact that his primary product has been illegal for a couple of years, he still has tons of resources at his disposal, and basically every member of Congress in his Rolodex. And so he launches this giant media blitz against Albert Lasker and the Shipping Board, and basically calls the United States government the biggest bootlegger in the world. And it leads to a Supreme Court case. It helps tip midterm elections for Congress that year. It kind of becomes this big tempest for a little while. Although Lasker doesn't really face, he kind of has to stop, but he basically holds out as long as he can. He doesn't face real consequences personally or anything like that. And it clearly doesn't overturn Prohibition. But it's this kind of really fascinating story about, how this rhetoric of Prohibition gets wielded by both sides to demonstrate, are we allowed to drink or not? Is it right to ban alcohol or not? All this kind of stuff. And it's this funny story about basically 2 giants of industry who just kind of happen to be on the opposite side. These people go to the same social club in any other context. They would go to the same social club and drink their illegal booze and smoke cigars and laugh about poor people or whatever it is rich people do in social clubs in any other context. But because they're on opposite sides of this, they have to tear each other apart in the media for several months at a time, and both have to kind of wield this language of Prohibition against each other to try and get their way. It really kind of turns into a fascinating story. I have a whole podcast about it.
Wow. And then is it your Substack or your website? It's Brewed Culture?
Broodculture.org. Yeah. It's just a website, just kind of links to other places I've published work.
No, it's great. There's so many articles I got to read them all. Cody, because I know you're still writing your article about the original Kegger, even if you've already asked him. Let's ask Brian a question related to the event or your research, or question that you haven't asked him yet.
Yeah, I guess, always a good question to ask people when they've researched something about this is like, what surprised you the most when you were researching the Kegger? I'm sure that could go in a lot of different directions with an event like this.
I guess what surprised me the most is, with the exception of, the marketing departments of giant breweries, I guess I was really surprised, one, how safe the Kegger was in its operation. We're talking about all this drunk driving that was happening, which is bad. I'm going to go on the record as being against drunk driving. I hope that doesn't shock anybody. So that was bad, definitely. But the organizers for the Kegger, they worked in remarkably good faith for years, especially considering like these weren't always the same people. This is 8 years of Keggers on a college campus. Students aren't there for 8 years most of the time. So a lot of the initial students who organized the Kegger, they did their years, they did their studies, and they graduated and moved on, and it was new people taking over. But the consistency of trying to maintain kind of safety and a strong organization on the part of the event was always there, and that was a strong ethos. And of course, the organizers, they had to make decisions, and those decisions reflected values. So obviously there were people, it would lead to disagreements, and I may not personally agree with the values. But what I'm talking about is there was a tradition of good faith that I think was really remarkable. And then even though a lot of people were concerned about the Kegger, about like, oh my God, this is going to lead to all this violence, it's going to lead to all this public fornication, people are going to die in drunk driving accidents. Remarkably few actual like injuries ever took place for an event that size. Like at any event with 10,000 people, you expect some injuries, right? You got to have first aid tent, all that kind of stuff. And the Kegger always did. But, for an event that size, the rate of injuries and incidents was remarkably low. And that always surprised me, to be honest.
That's very interesting. And Brian, what about Cody? He's coming at the Kegger from a different perspective.
Oh my goodness. I wrote you a bunch of questions privately at one point.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess my big question is how do you think the split came down on the University of Montana's campus, like the student body? Because you mentioned some students were worried about the reputation of the university. Yep. But obviously a lot of students liked to drink beer and go to the Kegger. So I guess where did the split fall? Was this like a 90-10 split or a 60-40 split? Like, where did the Kegger fall in the student opinion?
It's really interesting. That's a really great question. And of course, it's one of those things that it's sort of hard to parse out exactly how that went down. Because of course, even if I was going to make a table of letters to the paper sort of for or against in various ways, that's not necessarily representative, right? Because people are vocal about this in different ways. But, the one thing that does sort of show how student attitudes were changing was, in that final year, the attendance of the Kegger was down. I mean, the previous year, 1978, is sort of the record-setting year. There's 10,000 people at the Kegger, 10,000 official people. There were maybe up to 1,000 more who snuck in, because you could just sort of come down from the other side of the mountain into the Kegger. And they tapped 1,000 kegs. That's the year that gets them the reputation of being the world's largest benefit Kegger. And in that final year, attendance is down more toward like 8,000 people. They only tapped, I think, 800 kegs. Things were a little bit, which still is absurd to think about, right? Things are a little bit on the downslope, right? And so clearly, the boycott has something to do with that. But one of the other interesting things I found in my research was one of the other things that might have contributed to the waning interest among students was, the kind of music scene was changing. The kinds of bands that had been really popular and that had gone over gangbusters at the Kegger just weren't quite as hot in town anymore. And you can just sort of see that in some of the other kind of concert attendance figures happening in the region at the time. These sort of outdoor concerts are hospitable to a certain kind of music at the time, right? The sort of kind of country rock, very like Eaglesy stuff plays really well, as does kind of bluegrass, things like that. And, tastes were just changing. Students were sort of moving away from that stuff. And they were
not
moving
Jimmy
away
Buffett
from
fans anymore.
Yeah, right. And they're kind of moving away from enjoying these kind of big outdoor concerts too.
Can I ask one extra question related to the music scene?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
You've mentioned in your work, I know you haven't talked about it a ton directly right here, but you've mentioned in your work that some of the student body organizations, like the student governments, they were turning on the Kegger by the end. And they were even kind of taking steps to kind of withdraw support or trying to maybe hobble it a little bit. And I know that those same student organizations were also responsible for some like other concerts, like how the Grateful Dead played, a week after the Kegger in one of the years. They would organize like other events or whatever. Do you think that they were trying to sabotage the Kegger? That's a huge question I have.
Yeah, there might have been some resentment that the Kegger got the lion's share of the attention as far as campus entertainments when the Associated Students of the University of Montana, or ASUM as they were called, they really brought so much of the entertainment to campus. Most of the regular shows that were happening there, most of the touring acts that came through were people that they booked and got to play at the campus, So I think they probably rightfully took a lot of pride in that. And in a lot of in at least most of the early years of the Kegger until that final year, they had also fronted the money to pay for the bands that played at the Kegger. And so again, it's a lot of money too. And people are demanding more and more over the years as well. These touring acts are. So that's a factor. But again, there's also the factor of the kind of reputational concerns about the Kegger that might have gone into it too. And of course, the budgetary problems happening at the university. So they said the final year, okay, we can't front the money to pay for these bands. And what they cited as the reason for that was that, the budget, we've got this budget crunch, we just can't pay for it. And the Kegger had the money in the coffers that they could pay for it from the revenues. But basically it meant by the end of that last year, they didn't have any money left to donate, which again called into the question of what is this event? Right? Because it was a charity event. So if you don't have money to be able to give to the library or some of the other local charities that they'd started to give to in the later years, again, the sort of the purpose of the event kind of comes into question.
Wow, this has been a really great conversation. My last question is this: I need your help. I want a poster, an image of a poster from one of these events. And if you guys can get it, we'll put it on as maybe the show poster or some social media, because I think that you really tapped into a unique time, and it makes me probably realize why the drinking age is 21. I don't know. But again, we're not talking about that today. But I want to thank you guys so much. I'm Jimmy Carboni. I'm the host of Beer Sessions Radio. You guys can go around the room and one more time say who you are. Brian, then Cody.
All right. Yeah, I'm Brian Alberts, a beer historian focusing on U.S. beer culture.
And I am Cody Ewert, and I'm an associate editor for the Montana Historical Society.
All right, guys. Thanks so much for joining me on Heritage Radio Network. Big shout out to our engineer, Armin Spengen, who cleans this up and helps make it happen. We'll catch you next time on Beer Sessions Radio. All right. Thanks so much, guys.
Beer Sessions Radio is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network. Food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.